Well, curiouser and curiouser. Just 48 hours after we heard her tell her cousin on the telephone, courtesy of Russian TV. We didn't get it on British TV for several hours afterwards, and many hours afterwards, if you foolishly are dependent upon the BBC. She told her cousin that she was discharging herself from hospital and coming home. Now we've just heard, although from whom it is not said, that she intends to apply for diplomatic asylum here in Britain. The Sunday Times told us just yesterday that Yulia Skripal and her father both miraculously recovered from the military-grade nerve agent attack a month ago in Salisbury, were going to be transferred to the United States, given new identities, and will live the rest of their lives as, if you like, witness protection program, which would have the undoubted benefit that we would never see their faces or hear their voices ever again, never be entirely sure what had happened to them and at whose hands. Forgive me if I am skeptical. Forgive me if I have my doubts that Vladimir Putin was such a Mephistophelian genius that he could rig elections all over the world, even spark national revolutions like the one in Catalonia, but was so stupid that he failed to kill two targets, one of whom lived in Moscow and who could have been dispatched quietly any time with a military-grade nerve agent, 100 days before his own presidential election, 2 weeks before his own presidential election, and 100 days before the beginning of the World Cup, bringing the sky down on his head. That's why I queried from the beginning that on the question of motive, the official narrative of the British state fell at the first hurdle. Because if Putin had wanted to kill these people, there were far cheaper, far easier ways of doing so at a far more advantageous time. And I feel the same about the alleged chemical weapons attack, nerve agent attack in Syria, in the town of Douma on the eastern suburbs of Damascus too. There we were. President Trump had just announced that despite pressures on him to do the contrary, he was going to withdraw all of the United States service personnel from Syria. He was packing up and going home. 94% of all Syrian territory had been liberated from ISIS, Al-Qaeda, and the alphabet soup of Syrian Islamist extremism, and the Syrian Arab Army and its allies were on the very point of liberating the remaining 6%. Why then? It's the obvious time for the president of Syria to launch a chemical weapons attack to draw the United States back into the war, to bring down the sky upon him and his allies. Kind of obvious, isn't it? That is the obvious time to do such a thing, even when no military advantage conceivable could have been gained from doing so. We'll be talking about that to John White, writer and commentator on Syria in particular these days, who's just written an epic piece entitled "Is Bashar al-Assad the Most Stupid Man in the World?" Seems to echo the points that I have just been making to you. But on the subject of stupid, what can you say about the British Home Secretary, who denies that cutting police numbers has anything to do with the rise in violent crime, which in the capital alone has led to 56 murders this year already, and it's only the 9th of April. 56 murders and 20 people a day going to hospital with stab wounds, stab injuries. And when it was revealed a memo in the Home Office pointing out exactly the correlation between the cuts in police numbers and the rise in violent crime. Well, she done a whinger, didn't she? I didn't see it, she says. I never read it. She's poured quite a bit of money in the last few hours into the fight against crime in London. Unfortunately, none of it into the coffers of the Metropolitan Police, who've suffered 21,000 officers being reduced from the thin blue line that used to stand between us and the stabbers and the shooters and the violent criminals. We'll be talking to Kevin Marr, who knows a thing or two about Whitehall and Westminster, about that later. We'll be talking to my old friend John McTernan on the Blairite wing of the Labour Party, a former advisor, in fact, to Mr. Blair, about the story at the weekend that £50 million has been made available by a multi-millionaire to create a new centre party in British politics. No less than Nick Clegg, who destroyed the pre-existing centre party when he got into bed with David Cameron and formed that unholy alliance, that coalition, grotesque coalition of the Liberal Democrats and the Conservatives in 2010, has said there's a giant hole in the middle of British politics just waiting to be filled. Will this new centre party get off the ground? If it does, will £50 million be enough? And who will join it? And who will vote for it? John McTernan, whose politics are different to mine, but who's a personal friend of mine, is a pollster and a political analyst of many decades standing. He's also got his ear to the ground in that particular part of the political terrain. So we'll hear from him whether this centre party is a goer or not. And Dan Hodges, the attack dog of the Daily Mail, the man with whom I appeared on television and radio multiple times in the same day, only recently, just for Dan to recklessly make an allegation against the Stop the War coalition that he's had to withdraw and apologise for in social media today. I'm not going to crucify him over that. After all, it takes balls, it takes a bit of integrity to apologise when you've been wrong, and it takes even more balls to come back on the radio with me, the place where you made the offending remarks in the first place. But I'm going to be asking Dan, if you're listening, here's my first question. Don't you think you're becoming a little dangerously obsessed? Because you're not a bad fella, in my opinion, and you're quite a good writer. But there's no doubt that if you hate your opponents, it tends to cloud your judgment and tends to restrict the number of people that you can talk with, that you can relate to, and tends to ever narrow your purview on events. And I think that's what's happening to Dan Hodges, and I'm hoping by the time he's finished speaking with me this evening that he might have learned a lesson or two. So all of that is coming up in the next 3 hours, not on the James Whale Show, but on the mother of all talk shows.